Welcome, 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 my dear. They thought you were breaking when you were only bending, twisting, not cracking, adapting to their pressure like a snake, coiling tighter before it strikes. They watched you through sterile glass with clipboards and judgments, labeling your resistance as madness, your silence as instability. But what they never understood was that you were studying them. While they mocked your shadows, you mapped theirs. Every test they threw at you, every little game they called an evaluation, you played along like a good little experiment. But in your eyes, you weren't the patient. You were the scalpel. And the asylum they built to contain you, it was never a prison. It was a furnace, a place to forge what the world was too afraid to imagine. You, unhinged from their illusions. You didn't speak because words were too tame. You didn't fight back because chaos doesn't flinch. You waited, patient like a guillotine, knowing that sanity is not what bends, but what breaks them when it refuses to comply. They fed you pills like poisoned candy, tried to rewire your defiance into submission, called your questions delusions, your clarity paranoia. But you didn't need medication. You needed a mirror. And once you looked into one, you didn't see yourself. You saw them, naked, trembling, hiding behind their white coats, trying to drown your storm, because it reminded them of their own. And now they call you dangerous, not because you lost control, but because you took it back, with surgical precision, with a smile carved in absence, with vengeance that doesn't scream, it calculates. They never thought you'd survive the gauntlet of their manipulation, the passive-aggressive pats on the head, the fake concern dipped in venom. They laughed in meetings while discussing your progress. You were entertainment to them, a fragile psyche wrapped in a human shell, flailing for approval. But every condescending smirk, every sedated night under flickering lights, every time they scribbled lies in your file, they didn't break you, they fed you. And while they were distracted by their own arrogance, you outgrew the box they shoved you in. You evolved in the silence, perfected the art of pretending, learned the choreography of the sane, all while your real thoughts sharpened like blades behind your grin. They made you wear masks, so you became a master of them. Now, the face they see is the one they created, and it's the last face they'll remember, before everything they built burns. Your rise wasn't loud. It was methodical, a quiet infestation behind their walls. You didn't kick down doors. You became the door. You whispered doubts into their fragile hierarchies, made them question who signed what, who authorized which mistake. And when cracks began to spread in their perfectly painted facade, you didn't need to lift a finger. You watched them implode under their own weight. You planted chaos in their foundations and let time water it. Now they call it a system error, a misfire, a tragic miscalculation. But you know better. You weren't the mistake. You were the consequence. You were the invoice for every time they laughed at your pain, every diagnosis that was a dagger, every therapy session that was just a leash in disguise. You are the repayment plan they forgot they signed. They said you were a danger to yourself. What they didn't realize was that you were a threat to their delusion, because you saw the truth and refused to unsee it. You saw how the sane act like lunatics when no one's watching. You saw how order is a performance, and most of the audience is asleep. They told you to smile, to breathe, to color inside their lines. and you did. But now you own the crayons, and you're coloring in blood. You aren't out for redemption. You're here to collect retribution. Not loud and messy, not petty and rushed, but surgical, exact, poetic. You don't want revenge. That's what they'd expect. You want them to live long enough to understand, to look around their smoldering asylum and realize you didn't burn it out of rage. You burned it as a eulogy for the version of you they tried to erase. They'll never admit it, but the fear in their eyes is louder than any siren now. You see it when they avoid your gaze, when their hands tremble while pretending to hold control, when they whisper your name behind closed doors like a myth they hope isn't real. But myths don't bleed. Legends don't sign discharge papers, and phantoms don't light matches. You did. You, with your scars that became scripture. You, with your silence that now echoes louder than their alarms. You didn't escape their system. You infected it. You became the virus that corrupted their order. And now, everything they touch glitches. Everything they trust crumbles. They tested your mind and forgot that intelligence doesn't always wear a smile. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it plays broken. And sometimes it burns the whole institution just to light a cigarette from the ashes. No one talks about how power shifts in whispers, about how revolutions don't always begin with megaphones, but with whispers in padded cells, with one patient who stops playing their game, with one truth that slithers under the doors and crawls up their spines. They trained you to obey, and in doing so, they taught you how to infiltrate. Every yes you said was a scalpel behind your back. Every nod was a fuse waiting for your command. And when the moment came, you didn't scream. You lit the match and watched their blueprints curl into smoke. And now they panic. Now they scramble, trying to sweep up the embers of your sanity like broken glass. But it cuts them. It bleeds them. Because that madness they feared, it was never madness. It was clarity. And clarity is fire. You don't need validation now. You are the verdict. You are the final note in their symphony of control. They orchestrated your collapse, and now they dance in the inferno of their own denial. And as their alarms ring, and their sirens wail, and their authority collapses like rotten walls, there you stand. Not in shackles, not in a straitjacket, but in silence, smiling at the carnage. They asked for a test subject, and you gave them a god. They wanted to see how far a mind could bend before it broke. But instead, they watched you bend the world. And the best part? The fire hasn't finished spreading yet, because the structure wasn't the target. It was always the belief system, their twisted religion of control, worshiping at the altar of protocol, saluting the gods of diagnosis and restraint. But now the smoke isn't just choking their lungs, it's clouding their convictions. You've turned their doctrine into dust. Their definitions of sanity crumble in real time, like wet ash slipping between their fingers. And that is true liberation. Because once their rules become jokes, once their labels sound like comedy sketches instead of authority, you've already won. You're not out to dismantle them. You're just pulling away the curtains, letting everyone see the magicians were just terrified men fumbling with tricks they never understood. You're not angry anymore. You've outgrown that. Anger is a flame. But you became the wildfire. Controlled, targeted, knowing exactly which walls to lick first, which memories to ignite, which names to drag into the heat. You know the ones, the quiet tormentors, the ones who smiled too politely while marking you defective, the ones who called you a threat, just loud enough for the others to hear, just soft enough to deny. You haven't forgotten them. You don't need to scream their names. You've etched them into the walls with the smoke. Every room they walk into smells like the consequences they thought they'd buried. And it's funny, isn't it? How now they're the ones who whisper. They walk faster in hallways that used to echo with your footsteps. Their fingers tremble on clipboards that used to define your identity. They double-check locks that were once meant to cage you. It's not fear of violence. They know you're not here to throw punches. That would be merciful. No, what haunts them is the realization that you're watching, always one step ahead, always 10 layers deeper. They look over their shoulders because they know your mind now lives in the blueprints. You don't need to be in the room to rearrange it. You just leave a hint, an open file, a shifted chair, a humming light bulb, and they start unraveling on their own. You became their reflection. Not the face they wear in meetings, but the one they see when the mask slips. You took their tools, manipulation, silence, surveillance, and turned them against them. That's the real revenge. Making them live in the same fog they forced on you. Watching them flinch at shadows they once dismissed. Feeling the cold drip of paranoia they used to label you broken. They don't know where the threat ends now, because it doesn't. Because you're not a person anymore. You're a presence. A whisper in their sleep. A breath on the back of their necks when the hallway lights flicker. You didn't just escape the asylum. You made it haunted. This isn't chaos. This is justice wearing chaos like war paint. This is order being reshaped, cell by cell, into something they can't comprehend. They tried to control your behavior. Now they can't predict their own. They tried to measure your mind. Now their measurements don't make sense anymore. You erased their coordinates, scrambled the compass, turned the very idea of control into a myth. And they're not panicking because things are falling apart. They're panicking because they can't even define what apart looks like anymore. Somewhere in the rubble, there's still protocol, still a handbook, still rules scribbled in ink that pretends to matter. But it's just a relic now, a souvenir from when they thought the world was linear. You shattered that illusion with one truth they never dared admit, that sanity isn't compliance, it's confrontation, that real strength isn't smiling through pain, it's making the pain speak, loud, articulate, violent, if necessary. You didn't lose your mind, you turned it into a weapon. Forged from silence, sharpened by neglect, calibrated by trauma. They made the steel. You gave it purpose. They'll host meetings now. Emergency ones. Cold coffee, pale faces, closed blinds. They'll argue over what went wrong, where the containment breach occurred. But it wasn't a breach. It was a release. You let yourself out. Through every loophole, every contradiction, every ounce of their arrogance. They'll review footage that skips when you walk past the cameras. They'll stare at reports that rewrite themselves overnight. They'll file complaints with higher authorities who've already received anonymous dossiers, your fingerprints on every page, but no way to trace them. Every corner they turn, you've already painted with intent. This isn't just psychological warfare. This is surgical entropy. And somewhere deep down, one of them will finally say it out loud. Maybe in a whisper. Maybe drunk, alone, broken. Maybe we created this. And that will be the moment their descent becomes permanent. Because yes, they did. They created you not by accident, but by arrogance, by playing God with a scalpel and a pen, by treating your suffering like a checklist, by confusing suppression with healing. You were the result of their formula, the final equation they forgot to solve. They manufactured a monster and forgot monsters, remember? But you're not a monster. You're not their creation anymore. You're the correction, the backlash of every false label, the avalanche behind every silent scream they never heard. You're not here to make them understand. You're here to let them feel it. Because when the pain hits, without warning, without anesthesia, without apology, that's when truth finally registers. That's when the numbness breaks. That's when their eyes stop looking at you like a file and start looking at you like fate. And by then, it's too late. You've already lit the fuse and left the room. You don't need to explain yourself. You are the explanation. Every shattered record, every glitch in their reports, every frayed nerve and sleepless night, they all spell your name now, even if they're too afraid to say it. You've become the variable they can't factor out, the flaw in their perfect equation. And the beauty is, you're just getting started. They thought they could measure your depth, but they never realized you were the abyss. They tried to teach you boundaries, and now they're trapped inside the ones you rewrote. You didn't need to scream to be heard. You didn't need violence to leave marks. You didn't need to escape to take control. You simply waited for their system to rot from within, waited for their egos to blind them, waited until your silence was the loudest scream in the building. And when the time came, you didn't announce your rise. You let their own structure kneel to you. The asylum doesn't burn in memory of your pain. It burns in honor of your awakening. Because what they thought was your breakdown was really just your breakthrough. And now the ashes are still warm, the alarms still echo, and the world outside still thinks it's all just a glitch, a technical failure, a fluke. But behind the scenes, behind the headlines, behind the paper-thin apologies, the insiders know. They know. And it terrifies them. Because you're not done yet. They know you're not done. And that's what eats them alive. Because in their crumbling hierarchy, where they once held the scalpel and clipboard, they now clutch nothing but trembling breath. Their world didn't just collapse, it inverted. The corridors where they whispered about you now echo with your silence. The very silence they once weaponized now returned as a sentence they can't escape. And still they cling to hope, like it's not another form of delusion. They pray for explanations, for endings, for rules to crawl back into. But the system doesn't reboot when the virus becomes the architect. You're not playing games. You've redesigned the board, rewritten the language, redefined power. This isn't revenge, it's reconstruction. Brick by psychological brick, you're laying down a new asylum. Not of walls and chains, but of truths they tried to bury under diagnosis codes and prescription pads. They called your pain unstable. Now their reality shifts with every step. They labeled you dangerous. Now, they measure their breaths when the air thickens with the scent of consequence. And you haven't touched them, not once. But every thought they have now tastes like your shadow. You became their unfinished chapter, their unclosed file, the one anomaly that slipped through procedure, slithered past sedation, and returned not with rage, but with clarity. And that's what they fear the most. Not the scream, not the outburst, but the calm, the control, the knowing. Because once the puppet starts pulling strings, the hands tremble. And once the subject begins observing the observers, the delusion of control rots. They thought you'd vanish into obscurity. Instead, you became the blueprint of uprising. The spark in every silent patient staring at a wall. The echo in every therapy room where the counselor hesitates before asking the next question. You infected the system with doubt. And now doubt metastasizes faster than any madness they ever diagnosed. Every employee who fed the lie now twitches at the truth. Every peer who stayed silent now replays conversations, wondering if they missed the moment the tide shifted. They all did. You didn't become the chaos. You became the compass in the storm. They look around and see ruins. You see reform. The cracks in the foundation aren't faults. They're openings, invitations, and those still inside, they're not prisoners. They're seeds, just waiting for their own fracture, their own moment of illumination disguised as collapse. That's how this cycle begins again. But this time, they won't rise afraid. They'll rise aware. See, you didn't just burn down an asylum. You liberated an ideology. You gave insanity a language they could never suppress again. And in doing so, you turned suffering into scripture. Your name is no longer yours. It's become a movement, an unseen hand that removes masks with surgical precision. You became the storm not by force, but by invitation. You knocked. They ignored. You whispered. They mocked. You warned. They laughed. And now, as they gather the pieces, trying to reconstruct a world they no longer understand, they dare to ask, where did it all go wrong? Wrong? No, it went right. Exactly as it had to. Exactly as you allowed it. Because this ending isn't a mistake, it's an upgrade. And you're not a villain. You're a mirror. A necessary reflection of everything they've suppressed in the name of order. You didn't bring chaos to their doorstep. You simply showed them the chaos they'd locked in their basement. And when they finally looked down, when they saw what had been gnawing beneath their clean white uniforms, they realized the asylum wasn't protecting them from you. It was protecting them from themselves. And now the locks don't click like they used to. The walls don't feel safe anymore because they've realized what you always knew. Insanity isn't the threat, denial is. Their faith in systems, titles, and institutions was always brittle. You just proved it. You didn't unhinge the world. You just stopped pretending it was ever straight. They'll build new walls, try to start over, fresh paint, new names, smiling staff. But beneath it all, the blueprint remains infected. Because truth doesn't die in flames, it spreads. And your truth? It's contagious. It'll whisper in the ears of the difficult ones. It'll curl around the minds of those they can't quite fix. It'll plant seeds in the hearts of anyone who's ever been told to sit down and shut up. And when those seeds bloom, oh, they won't just walk out of the asylum. They'll walk through it like gods. So let them rebuild. Let them pretend. Let them act like it was all a tragic anomaly, one bad apple, one glitch in the matrix. They'll host seminars, write reports, craft narratives to explain the event without admitting the cause. They'll turn you into a case study, a cautionary tale, a horror story to keep others docile. But that's the beauty of it. The more they speak your name, the more they spread your message. Every retelling is an act of rebellion wearing the disguise of control. Every whisper is gasoline. Every warning, a flare. They can't bury you, because you were never flesh and bone. You're a reaction. And reactions never go quietly. They ask, where is the patient? Oh, the patient left the building. But the truth? It stayed. It lives in the lights that flicker too often, in the notes that don't match the facts, in the hallway that always feels colder than the rest. It lives in their doubt. And doubt, when fed the right trauma, grows claws. You won't come back, because you don't need to. You were never locked in that place. They were. And now, long after the smoke has cleared and the news cycle has moved on, the staff still wake at night to the scent of scorched leather. The patients still draw symbols they've never seen before. And the files, those precious, official clinical files, still rearrange themselves when no one's looking. This isn't revenge. This is permanence. This is a name engraved not in stone, but in nerve endings. They tested your sanity. They poked the dragon's eye and laughed when it blinked. Now, their asylum burns not in shame, but in your honor. Because when the world called you broken, you rewrote the definition of whole. And now they pray for the return of silence, not knowing that silence was the first sound of your rise.